Long before kingdoms rose and before crowns, armies, or written laws, people were already building places they believed connected them to something greater than themselves. Across forgotten hills, hidden forests, and lonely plains, our ancestors raised mysterious circles, towering stones, and sacred sanctuaries whose true purpose still puzzles archaeologists today. Why did they invest so much effort into these places, and what did they know that we've long forgotten? Tonight we'll journey back to the world's very first sacred places built thousands of years before the first kings ever ruled. If you enjoy exploring the greatest mysteries of ancient history, please like this video, subscribe, and join us for more incredible journeys into humanity's forgotten past. Now let's travel back to where civilization and perhaps belief itself first began. The wind moves first. It sweeps across a broad limestone ridge where no city stands, where no walls divide one family from another, and where no king has ever claimed the horizon. The landscape appears almost empty, broken only by scattered grasses, weathered stone, and distant herds crossing the valleys below. Yet beneath the surface lies one of the greatest surprises in the entire story of humanity. Long before palaces rise from river plains, long before crowns, armies, or written laws, people gather here for a purpose that leaves behind enormous circles of carved stone. They build not to defend themselves, not to store grain, and not to honor a ruler, but to create places that seem to belong to something larger than any single individual. It is here in a world that still remembers the Ice Age that one of history's deepest mysteries quietly begins. At first glance, this seems to overturn nearly everything once believed about civilization. For generations, historians imagine a familiar sequence. People settle into villages. Villages become towns. Agriculture creates food surpluses. Surpluses produce specialist leaders and eventually kings. Only then, after power becomes concentrated, do temples appear as symbols of organized religion. It is an elegant story, logical in its progression, and for a long time it appears to fit the evidence. Then archaeology begins uncovering something unexpected. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The earliest sacred landscapes refused to follow the old script. Instead of temples appearing after states emerge, the evidence increasingly suggests that monumental ceremonial places exist while humanity is still living in surprisingly flexible communities. These people know neither empires nor taxation. They leave behind no written chronicles explaining their beliefs. No royal inscriptions boast about glorious victories. No statues celebrate powerful monarchs. Their names vanish into time, yet the stones they raise remain asking a question that still echoes across archaeology today. Why would societies without kings invest astonishing amounts of labor into sacred architecture? To appreciate the scale of this puzzle, it helps to step backward more than 11,000 years to the closing chapters of the last great ice age. The world is changing with extraordinary speed. Massive glaciers that have dominated northern landscapes for thousands of years are retreating. Rivers shift course as meltwater reshapes valleys. Forests begin advancing into territories once covered by cold grasslands. Animal migrations change. Entire ecosystems reorganize themselves within the span of only a few human lifetimes. For communities living through these transformations, stability becomes something fragile. Generations grow up watching familiar hunting grounds evolve into unfamiliar landscapes. Lakes appear where none existed before. Other water sources disappear. Plants spread into new regions, while some of the great Ice Age animals gradually decline. Every season brings subtle reminders that the old world is fading. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that these environmental changes are not simply background scenery. They become part of the human experience itself. Communities adapt constantly, experimenting with new ways of gathering food, following migrating animals, harvesting wild cereals, and cooperating with neighbouring groups. Flexibility becomes one of humanity's greatest strengths. Yet survival alone does not explain what happens next. Across parts of Southwest Asia, particularly within the region known today as the Fertile Crescent groups, begin returning repeatedly to certain locations. These are not necessarily permanent villages in the modern sense. Many communities remain mobile for significant parts of the year, following seasonal rhythms that have guided their ancestors for countless generations. But some places acquire unusual importance. They become destinations rather than simple campsites. The reasons remain partly hidden. Scholars still debate whether these locations are chosen because of natural springs, dramatic hills, migration routes, unusual rock formations, or long-established traditions carried through generations. No single explanation fully accounts for every site. What becomes increasingly clear, however, is that people invest these landscapes with meanings extending far beyond practical necessity. A hill is no longer merely a hill. A clearing becomes a meeting place remembered across generations. A ridge overlooking wide valleys becomes a stage upon which communities gather, celebrate, mourn, exchange knowledge, arrange marriages, settle disputes, and perhaps communicate with worlds they believe exist beyond ordinary human experience. These gatherings are unlike anything previously imagined for societies often described simply as hunter-gatherers. That phrase itself can be misleading. It sometimes creates the impression of isolated families wandering endlessly across wilderness, with little social complexity. Archaeology paints a richer picture. Many prehistoric communities maintain extensive social networks, reaching across considerable distances. Stone tools, shells, pigments, and rare materials travel hundreds of kilometers through exchanges connecting groups that may meet only during certain seasons. Ideas travel alongside objects. Stories travel farther still. Every gathering offers opportunities to renew alliances, share resources. After difficult years, introduce younger generations to wider communities, and reinforce traditions that hold people together despite constantly changing environments. In such a world, sacred places become anchors of memory. They provide continuity even when landscapes themselves continue transforming. This possibility helps explain something remarkable. Monumental construction does not necessarily require a powerful ruler ordering thousands of workers into forced labor. Cooperation can emerge through shared belief. Communities may willingly contribute time, skill, and effort because the project itself expresses a common identity larger than any household. Modern experience sometimes makes this difficult to imagine. Monumental buildings are often associated with governments, wealthy institutions, or centralized authority. But human beings possess another powerful motivation that predates all of these structures' collective purpose. Anyone who has watched entire communities unite after natural disasters catches a glimpse of this ancient capacity. People organize without waiting for kings. They contribute because participation itself strengthens social bonds. Although prehistoric societies differ enormously from the modern world, the underlying principle may not be entirely unfamiliar. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeologists continue debating exactly how labor is organized at these earlier ceremonial sites. There are no surviving records listing workers or construction schedules, yet careful excavation reveals planning, coordination, and remarkable technical knowledge. Massive stones are selected deliberately. Pillars are shaped with impressive precision using simple stone tools. Layouts display intentional geometry rather than random placement. Someone measures, someone teaches, someone remembers techniques developed over generations. Knowledge itself becomes another form of inheritance preserved not in books but in skilled hands and shared experience. Perhaps the greatest surprise is that these sacred places seem to emerge during a period when humanity stands on the threshold of enormous change. Agriculture has not yet fully transformed society. Cities remain thousands of years away. Bronze tools do not exist. Wheels have not been invented. Writing lies far in the future. And yet people already imagine spaces unlike anything found in the natural world. They reshape stone into symbols carrying meanings now only partly understood. They return again and again to landscapes that bind separate communities together. They leave behind monuments that survive long after every individual memory disappears. The first sacred places are therefore more than ancient buildings. They represent one of humanity's earliest demonstrations that shared imagination can become physical reality. Before kingdoms define borders, before dynasties claim divine authority, before history acquires names and dates, ordinary people begin creating extraordinary places whose influence may quietly echo through every civilization that follows. The story has only just begun, and already it suggests that belief itself may have helped build the foundations of civilization, long before civilization knew its own name. The world grows warmer almost one season at a time, though no one living through it can measure the change except through memory. Elders remember valleys that once stayed frozen longer into the spring. Hunters speak of herds arriving along different routes than they did in their youth. Rivers swell with meltwater before settling into unfamiliar channels, and patches of woodland slowly spread across open country, where grasslands had stretched for countless generations. To later historians, this period becomes known as the transition into the Holocene, the beginning of the stable climate that still shapes the modern world. To the people experiencing it, however, there is no name for the transformation. There is only the growing realization that the land itself no longer behaves as it once did. For thousands of years, human communities have become masters of adaptation. Their ancestors survived brutal, cold, shifting coastlines, volcanic eruptions, and dramatic swings in rainfall. Flexibility is woven into daily life. Camps move when resources become scarce. Hunting strategies evolve as prey changes. Knowledge passes from one generation to another, not through written instruction, but through observation, repetition, and memory. Every child learns to read subtle signs in the landscape because survival depends upon understanding winds, animals, plants, stars, and seasons. Yet the warming climate creates opportunities as well as challenges. Wild cereals begin flourishing across broad regions of Southwest Asia. Stands of einkorn and emmer wheat appear more predictably in certain valleys. Pistachio trees, almonds, and wild legumes become increasingly abundant. Gazelle herds continue moving through the countryside while birds gather around expanding wetlands. Instead of existing within scattered pockets of seasonal abundance, many environments begin offering longer periods of reliable food. This does not immediately create farming. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that people remain highly skilled foragers for many generations. They gather wild grains, collect fruits and nuts, hunt a wide range of animals, and exploit diverse landscapes rather than relying on a single source of survival. Scholars still debate exactly how quickly these economic changes unfold, and the evidence varies from region to region. Human history rarely follows one simple path. Even so, a subtle shift begins taking shape. Communities no longer need to roam quite as endlessly as before. Some groups spend longer periods in favoured locations. Seasonal camps become places revisited year after year. Familiar valleys acquire deeper emotional importance because grandparents, parents, and children all know the same landmarks. Memory accumulates in the landscape itself. This growing attachment changes more than daily routines. When people return repeatedly to the same place, relationships also deepen. Neighbouring communities become familiar rather than completely unknown. Certain gathering grounds gain reputations extending far beyond individual territories. Knowledge spreads about locations where many groups can meet safely during particular seasons. Such meetings are practical, but they are rarely only practical. Marriage partners may be found among distant communities, reducing isolation and strengthening social connections. Stone suitable for making blades can be exchanged for shells, carried inland from distant coasts. Pigments, carved ornaments, and finely crafted tools circulate through expanding networks that stretch across hundreds of kilometers. Alongside these valuable materials travel songs, rituals, stories, artistic styles, and shared beliefs. The archaeological evidence for these long-distance connections is striking. Obsidian originating from volcanic regions appears far from its natural source. Marine shells reach inland settlements separated from the sea by great distances. Decorative stones travel through communities that possess no local supply. These discoveries reveal societies that are anything but isolated. Instead, they belong to dynamic networks, linking thousands of people who may never meet all at once, but who nevertheless participate in remarkably broad cultural worlds. Such networks require trust. Trust requires repeated contact. Repeated contact often becomes easier when communities gather around places carrying special significance. Here the sacred begins to intertwine with the social in ways that archaeologists continue trying to understand. A ceremonial gathering is not simply an act of worship as modern observers might imagine it. It may also reinforce alliances, resolve disputes before they become violent, arrange exchanges of food during difficult years, introduce young adults to future spouses, and renew traditions that bind otherwise independent groups together. The sacred place functions almost like the beating heart of an enormous seasonal network whose members spend much of the year living apart. No single explanation fully accounts for these gatherings, yet this broader perspective helps illuminate why monumental construction becomes conceivable even without kings directing the work. Every visitor arrives carrying skills. Some understand stone. Others possess remarkable hunting knowledge. Some excel at preparing enormous communal meals. Others preserve stories explaining why these places matter. Each contribution strengthens the whole. Rather than existing above society, sacred space may become the mechanism through which society itself grows larger and more interconnected. Meanwhile, human imagination is changing alongside the environment. Archaeological discoveries reveal increasing attention to symbolic objects. Decorative beads become more common. Carefully shaped bone tools display artistic touches beyond simple utility. Pigments such as red ochre continue playing important roles in rituals whose exact meanings remain uncertain. Burials sometimes receive deliberate treatment, suggesting that death has become surrounded by increasingly complex beliefs about memory, ancestry, or identity. None of these developments appear suddenly. Instead, they accumulate gradually across centuries. The evidence remains incomplete, but together these clues suggest that human beings are investing more energy in expressing shared meanings through objects, ceremonies, and places. The invisible world of belief begins leaving visible traces in the archaeological record. Even architecture itself starts changing. Earlier shelters are primarily designed for protection against weather. They serve practical needs first. Now certain structures appear whose purpose extends beyond ordinary domestic life. Circular forms become surprisingly common. Stone installations are arranged with care. Open spaces are deliberately enclosed not to keep enemies away, but to define areas where particular activities occur. Boundaries become symbolic as well as physical. Crossing into such places may have carried emotional significance understood instinctively by those who gathered there. Although no written explanation survives, careful planning suggests that these spaces are designed to shape human experience rather than merely provide shelter. The timing of all this is remarkable. Population numbers are gradually increasing in some favourable regions, though estimates remain uncertain. Better environmental conditions allow more children to survive into adulthood. Communities become slightly larger than many of their Ice Age predecessors. With more people comes greater opportunity for specialization. Not everyone needs identical knowledge. Certain individuals may become especially skilled stoneworkers, ritual leaders, healers, storytellers, or builders. This does not yet resemble social classes in later civilizations. Archaeologists find little evidence for powerful hereditary elites dominating these early communities. Differences in status appear relatively modest, compared with the kingdoms that will emerge thousands of years later. Leadership, where it exists, is likely flexible and situational rather than absolute. That distinction matters enormously. It suggests that cooperation capable of producing monumental architecture can emerge without rigid hierarchies. Shared purpose, accumulated tradition, and seasonal collaboration may accomplish feats once assumed possible, only under centralized authority. This realization quietly transforms humanity's own story. Civilization is often imagined as beginning with rulers who organize passive populations into increasingly complex states. But the earlier sacred landscapes hint at another possibility. Perhaps collective identity grows first. Perhaps large-scale cooperation begins not because people are forced together, but because they choose to gather around beliefs powerful enough to unite strangers. If that is true, then the first monuments are not monuments to power. They are monuments to cooperation itself. Across the hills and valleys of the ancient Near East, this invisible transformation continues unfolding. Communities separated by weeks of travel nevertheless become participants in a shared ceremonial world. Generation after generation adds new layers of memory to places that will eventually astonish archaeologists thousands of years later. Among those hills stands one particular ridge where these quiet changes reach an extraordinary scale. Their enormous pillars rise from the earth carved with animals, unlike anything seen before, preserving the clearest surviving evidence that humanity begins building sacred worlds long before it builds kingdoms. The limestone ridge does not look extraordinary from a distance. It rises gently above the surrounding landscape, overlooking rolling hills that today lie within southeastern Turkey. Even after thousands of years of erosion, the elevation commands wide views across valleys that once supported abundant wildlife and seasonal movement. To travellers passing nearby 11 millennia ago, the ridge is visible long before its purpose becomes clear. There are no towering walls, no fortified gates, no permanent skyline announcing the approach of a city. Instead, something much stranger is taking shape. Groups begin arriving from different directions. Some carry finely crafted stone tools wrapped carefully for the journey. Others bring baskets, hunting equipment, pigments, or food gathered along the way. Children walk beside experienced hunters. Skilled craftspeople travel with individuals whose knowledge cannot be measured by the objects they carry but by the stories they remember. No written invitations summon these gatherings. No ruler orders attendance. Yet generation after generation, people continue returning to this place with remarkable consistency. The scale of what they accomplish remains astonishing even by modern standards. Building with stone demands planning before the first block is ever moved. Suitable limestone must be identified, examined for flaws, and separated from the bedrock using hammerstones fashioned from harder rock. Archaeologists studying the site discover unfinished pillars still attached to the quarry, revealing part of the process. Workers carve deep grooves around the outlines before gradually freeing the immense slabs from the surrounding stone. Some of these pillars weigh many tons. No wheels exist. No metal tools exist. No domesticated draft animals pull heavy loads. Everything depends upon human coordination. Exactly how these stones are transported remains one of the site's enduring puzzles. Scholars have proposed combinations of wooden sledges, ropes made from plant fibers, rollers fashioned from timber, where available, and carefully prepared pathways. Experimental archaeology demonstrates that surprisingly large objects can indeed be moved by coordinated teams using relatively simple technology. Even so, each successful transport represents an extraordinary collective achievement, requiring patience, planning, and mutual trust. This is not the work of isolated families acting independently. Someone understands quarrying techniques. Someone directs the carving. Someone organizes labor. Someone ensures enough food reaches the workers. Someone preserves knowledge about the correct placement of each pillar. Yet none of this necessarily requires a king. Modern assumptions often equate organization with government, but prehistoric societies remind us that complexity and hierarchy are not identical. Many traditional communities throughout history have coordinated impressive communal projects through shared customs rather than centralized political power. Leadership can emerge temporarily according to skill, experience, or ritual responsibility, instead of permanent authority. The evidence from these earlier sacred places appears consistent with that possibility. Every pillar begins as ordinary limestone, but careful craftsmanship transforms it into something extraordinary. Rather than rough supporting columns, many are shaped into elegant T-forms. Unlike typical architectural elements, their surfaces are smoothed with remarkable care. Some display carved belts around their lower sections. Others include stylized arms and hands running down their sides. These details are subtle. At first glance, they can be overlooked entirely. Then the realization slowly emerges. The pillars themselves may represent human figures. Not realistic statues with faces and individual features, but highly abstract beings, standing silently within carefully arranged circles. Their broad horizontal tops resemble shoulders. Their carved arms suggest posture. Belts and loincloths hint at identity. They are neither simple structural supports nor purely decorative monuments. They appear to embody presence. Who these figures represent remains uncertain. Some archaeologists suggest ancestors. Others propose powerful supernatural beings. Still others believe they symbolize respected members of the community whose individual identities have long disappeared from memory. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every detail. Without written texts, certainty remains impossible. Yet almost every interpretation agrees on one point. Meaning matters here as much as engineering. The arrangement of the pillars strengthens this impression. Rather than standing randomly across the hilltop, they form carefully planned circular or oval enclosures. Massive central pillars often face one another, surrounded by smaller stones positioned around the perimeter. This repeated design appears intentional across multiple structures built during different phases of the site's long history. Geometry becomes part of ritual. Space itself acquires symbolic order. Standing inside one of these enclosures must have produced an experience unlike anything found in the surrounding wilderness. Towering stone figures encircle those entering the space. Carved animals emerge from the surfaces as if alive within the rock itself. The open sky stretches overhead without a roof, allowing sunlight, clouds, stars, and changing seasons to become participants in ceremonies whose precise nature remains forever beyond direct observation. Silence may have carried enormous weight. Even today, ancient sacred places often evoke emotional responses difficult to explain. Their architecture shapes movement, attention, and perception. The earliest builders almost certainly understand this instinctively. Monumental space influences the human mind long before architects possess formal theories about design. Construction also unfolds across generations. One group does not simply arrive, build everything, and leave forever. Instead, archaeological evidence suggests repeated episodes of building, modification, burial, and rebuilding over centuries. Younger generations inherit not only physical structures, but also the responsibility to maintain traditions whose origins may already seem ancient to them. Memory deepens with every return. This continuity reveals something important about prehistoric society. Large projects require confidence that future generations will continue the work. Parents teach children quarrying techniques. Stoneworkers pass along specialized knowledge. Ceremonial practices survive because communities actively preserve them. Culture itself becomes an inheritance stronger than any individual lifespan. Food must also sustain this enormous effort. Excavations uncover vast quantities of animal bones, particularly from wild gazelle, aurochs, wild boar, and deer. These remains suggest large communal feasts accompany at least some construction activities. Rather than representing everyday meals, the sheer volume points toward gatherings involving many participants. Imagine the scene. Hunting parties arrive after successful expeditions across surrounding valleys. Fires burn through the evening as meat is prepared for hundreds of people. Stone bowls hold gathered plants and grains. Skilled artisans continue carving while children observe techniques they will someday practice themselves. Elders recount stories explaining why this hill matters. Ceremonies unfold beneath stars, visible with extraordinary clarity in an age untouched by artificial light. Work and ritual become inseparable. Building the sanctuary may itself be part of the ceremony. This possibility changes how archaeologists think about labor. Instead of viewing construction merely as preparation for religious activity, some scholars suggest that the collective act of building strengthens social bonds. Every lifted stone, every carved surface, every shared meal reinforces relationships among communities scattered across the wider landscape. The monument is not simply the finished structure. The monument is also the process that creates it. Such an idea feels surprisingly modern while remaining deeply ancient. Human beings often form their strongest connections by accomplishing difficult tasks together. Cooperation generates identity. Shared effort produces belonging. Perhaps the builders understand this without needing to explain it in words. The animals carved across the pillars add another layer of mystery. Foxes stride confidently along polished surfaces. Snakes twist through the stone in elegant curves. Wild boars, cranes, vultures, lions, scorpions, and powerful aurochs appear with striking realism. Rarely are these peaceful domestic creatures. Instead, they belong to the untamed world surrounding the sanctuary. Why these particular animals dominate remains one of archaeology's greatest unanswered questions. Were they clan symbols, spiritual guardians, representations of dangerous forces inhabiting the natural world, elements of myths now completely forgotten? Scholars continue debating every possibility, yet agreement remains elusive. What cannot be disputed is the extraordinary skill involved. These carvings reveal artists capable of close observation, technical precision, and sophisticated symbolic thinking. Their work survives not because they sign their names, but because the stone itself remembers their hands. Long before history records the first kings, long before royal monuments celebrate dynasties, anonymous builders create one of humanity's most remarkable sacred landscapes. They leave behind no written explanation of their intentions. Instead, they allow the stones to ask the questions for them. For thousands of years, the hill sleeps beneath its own history. Wind carries dust across the ridge. Rain slowly washes soil into abandoned enclosures. Wild grasses take root where towering pillars once stand exposed beneath the open sky. Generations come and go without realizing that entire ceremonial worlds lie hidden only a few meters below their feet. Empires rise across the Near East, from the earliest Mesopotamian cities to the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Ottomans. Each leaves monuments of its own. Yet beneath them all, the much older sanctuary waits in complete silence, preserving a chapter of humanity that no written history remembers. The burial of the site is itself extraordinary. Unlike many ancient settlements that gradually disappear through collapse or erosion, these monumental enclosures are intentionally filled with enormous quantities of earth-broken stone animal bones and other material. The builders do not simply abandon them to the weather. They carefully cover them, creating artificial mounds that conceal the structures with remarkable effectiveness. Why they do this remains one of the site's greatest mysteries. Scholars still debate whether the burial marks the conclusion of ceremonies, the symbolic retirement of sacred spaces changing religious beliefs, practical landscape management, or some combination of several factors. The evidence remains incomplete. What is certain is that the filling process is deliberate. It requires tremendous labor, almost as much commitment as the original construction itself. It is an ending chosen rather than imposed. That single fact distinguishes these sanctuaries from many later monuments destroyed by invasion or natural disaster. Centuries pass, then millennia. By the modern era, the hill appears unremarkable enough that local farmers cultivate parts of its surface. Fragments of worked limestone occasionally emerge from the soil, but few suspect their true age. Some carved stones are incorporated into later buildings nearby. Others remain scattered across the fields, their original context long forgotten. In the 20th century, archaeologists begin surveying the region more systematically. During the 1960s, researchers note the presence of stone fragments and unusual features on the hill. They recognize archaeological potential, but interpret the remains as belonging mainly to a Byzantine cemetery. The site is recorded, but no one yet imagines that something vastly older lies beneath. History almost overlooks one of its greatest discoveries. The turning point arrives decades later. In the 1990s, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt revisits the location while studying prehistoric settlements in southeastern Anatolia. Looking across the hill, he notices something that earlier surveys have not fully appreciated. The carved limestone fragments do not resemble ordinary grave markers. The shape of certain stones seems strangely familiar, matching material found at nearby Neolithic sites. His intuition proves remarkably accurate. Excavations begin in 1995. Almost immediately, enormous carved pillars emerge from the soil. The first discoveries challenge expectations, but as excavation continues, the scale becomes increasingly astonishing. Circular enclosures appear one after another. Massive T-shaped monoliths stand exactly where prehistoric builders leave them thousands of years earlier. Animal carvings cover the surfaces with extraordinary craftsmanship. Every new trench reveals additional complexity. Archaeologists quickly realize they are looking at something unlike any previously known prehistoric site. Radiocarbon dating transforms surprise into genuine scientific shock. The oldest layers date to roughly the 10th millennium before the Common Era, more than 11,000 years ago. This chronology changes everything. Until then, most scholars believed monumental religious architecture belongs to societies already practicing agriculture on a substantial scale. Instead, here stands overwhelming evidence that sophisticated ceremonial construction predates fully developed farming communities. The implications spread rapidly through archaeology. Old assumptions begin giving way to new questions. Perhaps religion encourages social cooperation before agriculture becomes dominant. Perhaps ceremonial gatherings help create the conditions necessary for farming. Perhaps both developments influence one another in complicated ways that resist simple cause and effect explanations. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. The discovery does not overturn everything previously understood about prehistory, but it forces researchers to rethink long-held models describing how complex societies emerge. Media coverage soon introduces the site to audiences around the world. Headlines often describe it as the world's oldest temple. The phrase captures public imagination, yet many archaeologists use it cautiously. The modern word temple carries assumptions drawn from later civilizations, possessing priests, organized religions, permanent settlements, and formal institutions. The builders of this sanctuary live in a very different social world. Calling it a temple communicates its sacred character. Calling it only a temple risks oversimplifying its unique place in human history. Researchers therefore continue debating the most appropriate description: ceremonial center, ritual complex, sacred gathering place, monumental sanctuary. Each term highlights part of the picture without capturing it entirely. As excavation progresses, another remarkable fact emerges. Only a small percentage of the entire site has been uncovered. The hill contains multiple construction phases stacked across centuries. New enclosures are built while older ones are intentionally buried. Geophysical surveys reveal additional structures still hidden beneath untouched areas. Every excavation season answers some questions while uncovering many more. In this way, the site continues behaving much like the civilization that created it. It reveals itself slowly. The discoveries also highlight the extraordinary preservation created by deliberate burial. Because many carvings remain sealed beneath protective layers of soil for thousands of years, delicate details survive with astonishing clarity. Foxes appear poised in mid-step. Birds stretch elegant wings across polished stone. Snakes coil through carefully carved reliefs. Even subtle marks left by prehistoric tools remain visible under favorable lighting. Standing before these pillars today creates an unusual sensation. The carvings seem unexpectedly immediate. The artists who shape them disappear into deep time, yet the movement captured in stone still feels alive. This emotional connection explains why the site fascinates not only archaeologists, but also artists, historians, anthropologists, and millions of visitors. It narrows the apparent distance between modern humanity and people often imagined as unimaginably remote. The builders are separated from us by more than 100 centuries, yet their desire to create meaningful places feels surprisingly familiar. At the same time, scientific caution remains essential. Popular imagination sometimes races ahead of evidence. Extraordinary discoveries naturally attract speculative theories involving lost civilizations, forgotten advanced technologies, or mysterious outside influences. Such ideas circulate widely across books, documentaries, and the internet. Mainstream archaeology finds no convincing evidence supporting these claims. Everything uncovered so far points toward remarkably capable prehistoric communities, using stone tools, accumulated experience, careful planning, and collective labor. Their achievements are astonishing precisely because they are fully human. There is no need to invent mythical engineers. The real builders accomplish enough on their own. Indeed, attributing their work to imaginary civilizations or supernatural assistance unintentionally diminishes the ingenuity of the people who actually create these monuments. Their intelligence deserves recognition without embellishment. Excavations continue year after year, gradually expanding understanding of the sanctuary, while reminding researchers how much remains hidden. Every carved pillar raises fresh questions about belief symbolism, organization, and memory. Every newly uncovered enclosure strengthens one conclusion that now seems unavoidable. Long before kings claimed divine authority, ordinary human communities possessed the vision, patience, and cooperation necessary to reshape entire landscapes into sacred places. Yet perhaps the most enigmatic aspect of all is not the architecture itself. It is the language carved across the stone. Animals, abstract symbols, mysterious signs, and carefully arranged imagery cover many of the pillars, preserving messages whose meanings remain locked within a worldview that vanished thousands of years before the invention of writing. The stones speak. Modern humanity simply no longer understands their language. The first impression is often one of movement. Although the stone pillars themselves stand perfectly still, the creatures carved across their surfaces seem almost unwilling to remain frozen. Foxes stride confidently along narrow edges as though crossing invisible paths. Snakes twist downward in flowing lines that catch changing light throughout the day. Cranes lift their elongated necks toward the open sky. Wild boars lower their heads with unmistakable strength, while powerful aurochs appear ready to charge from the limestone itself. Scorpions, spiders, lions, vultures, gazelles, ducks, and countless other animals emerge with remarkable vitality. The artists responsible for these carvings know these creatures intimately. Nothing about the relief suggests casual observation. Every curve of a fox's body, every feathered wing, every muscular shoulder reflects generations spent living among the natural world rather than merely passing through it. These are not imaginary beasts invented to decorate sacred architecture. They belong to the everyday landscape surrounding the sanctuary. Yet they are not arranged randomly. That simple fact has occupied archaeologists for decades. Some pillars feature only a few carefully chosen animals. Others display several species together in combinations that seem intentional rather than accidental. Certain enclosures contain repeated motifs, while neighbouring circles emphasize different creatures altogether. The patterns hint at a symbolic language whose grammar has long disappeared. Unfortunately, the builders leave behind no written explanation. Writing itself will not appear in this part of the world for several thousand more years. There are no myths preserved on clay tablets, no priestly manuals describing ceremonies, no inscriptions identifying the figures carved into stone. Modern researchers are forced to work backward from the physical evidence alone. This is both the excitement and the frustration of prehistoric archaeology. Every discovery expands knowledge while simultaneously exposing how much remains unknowable. Scholars still debate whether the animals represent spiritual beings, seasonal cycles, clan identities, dangerous forces within nature, or stories passed orally through countless generations. No single explanation fully accounts for every carving. Each theory captures part of the evidence while leaving other questions unanswered. One possibility suggests that the animals embody powers respected and feared by prehistoric communities. Many of the carved species are not gentle or easily controlled. Snakes carry venom. Wild boars can inflict devastating injuries. Lions dominate predators across parts of the ancient Near East. Scorpions remain dangerous despite their small size. Even vultures, although rarely threatening to healthy humans, occupy a powerful place within the emotional landscape of death. Living closely with wildlife means understanding both its beauty and its risks. Unlike modern societies where most dangerous animals exist far from everyday experience, prehistoric people share their world with creatures capable of killing them. Respect for such animals naturally becomes woven into stories, rituals, and symbolic thinking. Another interpretation focuses less on fear and more on ecological knowledge. Each animal occupies a specific place within the landscape. Their seasonal appearances signal changes in weather migration breeding cycles, or the availability of important resources. Communities depending upon hunting and gathering become expert observers of these patterns. The carvings may therefore preserve accumulated environmental knowledge expressed through sacred imagery. Religion and ecology need not exist separately. In many traditional societies documented throughout history, understanding the natural world and expressing spiritual belief are deeply intertwined. Ceremonies often reinforce practical knowledge, while simultaneously connecting people to larger cosmological ideas. The prehistoric builders may have viewed this distinction very differently from the modern world. One of the most intriguing details appears on the great central pillars themselves. Unlike later monumental statues celebrating individual rulers, these towering figures remain almost completely anonymous. Faces are absent. Distinctive personal features never appear. Instead, the bodies are abstracted into elegant simplicity, emphasizing posture rather than identity. This artistic decision seems deliberate. The absence of faces invites countless interpretations. Perhaps the figures represent ancestors whose individual names no longer matter. Perhaps they symbolize supernatural beings beyond ordinary human appearance. Perhaps they stand for humanity itself rather than any single person. The evidence remains incomplete and certainty continues to elude researchers. What is clear, however, is that individuality appears less important than presence. The pillars stand as enduring participants within the ceremonial landscape rather than portraits of famous individuals. This marks a profound contrast with later civilizations. When kingdoms emerge thousands of years afterward, monumental sculpture often glorifies rulers. Pharaohs commissioned statues displaying recognizable royal features. Mesopotamian kings carve military victories into stone. Roman emperors fill cities with their own likenesses. Nothing comparable exists here. The monuments celebrate something larger than personal authority. Another fascinating mystery lies in the careful positioning of the carvings. Animals frequently appear facing particular directions or occupying specific heights on the pillars. Some reliefs wrap around corners, forcing viewers to move physically around the stone before seeing the complete image. Others remain partially hidden until approached from exactly the right angle. This suggests that movement through the sanctuary matters. The carvings are not simply pictures to be viewed from one position. They become experiences unfolding as people walk among the pillars. Architecture, sculpture, and ceremony combine into a single environment carefully designed to shape perception. Such sophistication challenges outdated assumptions about prehistoric art as merely decorative. These builders understand visual storytelling remarkably well. Recent research has introduced additional layers of complexity through the discovery of abstract symbols carved alongside animals. Certain signs repeat across multiple pillars, raising the possibility that they carry consistent meanings understood by the builders. Some researchers cautiously compare these recurring symbols to early systems of communication. Others argue that calling them proto-writing stretches the evidence too far. Mainstream archaeology generally favors caution. Writing requires the ability to record language systematically, and no convincing evidence demonstrates that these symbols perform that function. They are better understood, at least for now, as elements within a symbolic tradition, whose precise meanings remain unknown. Even so, their repeated appearance suggests intentional communication. The stones are saying something. Modern observers simply lack the cultural framework necessary to understand the message. One particularly debated scene involves vultures. Across several Neolithic sites in the wider region, vultures appear repeatedly within symbolic contexts. This has encouraged comparisons with later practices documented at places such as Çatalhöyük, where some evidence suggests that human remains may have been exposed to birds before burial. Whether similar customs occur at this earlier sanctuary remains uncertain. Scholars still debate the connection. No single explanation fully accounts for the available evidence, and archaeologists remain careful not to project later traditions directly backward in time. Nevertheless, the recurring appearance of vultures hints that these birds hold meanings extending beyond simple observation of wildlife. Perhaps they symbolize transformation. Perhaps they represent journeys between life and death. Perhaps their significance belongs to stories forever lost. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the fascination. Modern science excels at reconstructing diets through chemical analysis, tracing migration through ancient DNA, and determining ages through radiocarbon dating. Yet belief rarely fossilizes so neatly. Thoughts, emotions, and myths leave only indirect traces. Stone preserves images, it does not preserve explanations. That absence invites imagination, but responsible archaeology resists filling every silence with confident speculation. Instead, researchers allow evidence to guide interpretation, accepting that some mysteries may never be fully resolved. Perhaps this restraint is one reason the sanctuary continues captivating both specialists and the public alike. It reminds us that the distant past remains a conversation rather than a completed book. Every newly uncovered carving adds another sentence. Every excavation reveals another fragment of a language whose vocabulary grows richer, even as its grammar remains elusive. Standing among these silent pillars today, one senses that their creators are not attempting to impress future civilizations with technological achievements. They are expressing a worldview, a way of understanding animals, landscapes, memory, community, and unseen forces. Although the precise meanings have faded beyond recovery, the act itself remains unmistakably human. People gather. People create symbols. People invest ordinary stone with extraordinary significance. And in doing so, they reveal that long before humanity records history with words, it is already writing its deepest ideas into the enduring language of rock. If the towering pillars are the most visible achievement of these early ceremonial landscapes, the people themselves remain almost invisible. No portraits survive. No names echo across the centuries. No inscriptions celebrate master builders, respected elders, or gifted artists. The men and women responsible for one of humanity's greatest architectural revolutions disappear almost completely from history, leaving behind only fragments of their daily lives scattered beneath layers of soil. Yet those fragments, patiently uncovered one by one, allow archaeologists to reconstruct a world far richer than anyone once imagined. The first clue comes not from the monuments themselves, but from what lies around them. Excavations recover thousands upon thousands of animal bones. Most belong to wild species. Gazelle remains dominate many deposits, reflecting the enormous seasonal migrations that once crossed this region. Wild boar, red deer, aurochs, wild sheep, birds, and smaller mammals also appear in impressive numbers. These are not the remains of domesticated herds carefully managed by farmers. They come from experienced hunters operating within remarkably productive natural landscapes. The evidence reinforces an increasingly important conclusion. The builders are not fully agricultural societies. For generations, many scholars assume that only farming can produce enough food to support monumental construction. The discoveries challenge that assumption without entirely overturning it. Communities continue relying heavily upon hunting and gathering, yet they also demonstrate an extraordinary ability to organize labor on a large scale. This realization forces archaeology to reconsider an old question. Perhaps food surplus alone is not what creates complex cooperation. Perhaps social relationships matter just as much. Imagine dozens, perhaps even hundreds of people arriving during the peak of gazelle migration. Successful hunts provide enormous quantities of meat. Instead of consuming everything within isolated camps, communities gather for shared feasts around sacred spaces. The celebration itself strengthens alliances while simultaneously providing the nutrition necessary for demanding construction work. In this interpretation, ritual and survival become partners rather than separate aspects of life. Feasting leaves surprisingly durable archaeological evidence. Large concentrations of animal bones appear together with stone tools used for butchering. Massive limestone vessels, some capable of holding significant quantities of food or drink, are uncovered within the ceremonial complex. Grinding stones reveal that gathered plants are processed alongside meat. Together, these discoveries suggest meals on a scale extending well beyond ordinary household consumption. These are communal events. Their importance likely reaches far beyond satisfying hunger. Throughout human history, shared meals often serve purposes impossible to measure simply by calories. Agreements are renewed around food, marriages are arranged, stories are retold, children observe customs that define their identity, visitors strengthen friendships with distant communities. Rituals marking seasonal change frequently culminate in collective feasting. The prehistoric sanctuary may function in remarkably similar ways. The evidence remains incomplete, but the repeated association between ceremonial architecture and large-scale food preparation strongly suggests that eating together forms an essential part of the site's social life. Another unexpected discovery concerns tools. Thousands of finely crafted flint blades emerge during excavation. Many display exceptional workmanship. Some show signs of heavy use while others appear almost pristine. Their quality demonstrates specialized craftsmanship developed through years of experience. This specialization is significant. It reveals that not everyone possesses identical skills. Certain individuals become expert stoneworkers. Others excel at hunting. Some understand carving techniques capable of transforming rough limestone into monumental sculpture. Knowledge becomes increasingly diverse. Yet diversity of skill does not automatically imply rigid social hierarchy. Modern societies often equate specialization with professions, institutions, and economic classes. Prehistoric communities likely organize knowledge differently. Expertise may circulate through kinship networks, apprenticeships, seasonal cooperation, and oral instruction rather than formal occupations. A talented stoneworker teaches younger relatives. An experienced hunter trains adolescents during expeditions. Ritual knowledge passes gradually from respected elders to the next generation. Culture grows stronger because knowledge is shared instead of centralized. The absence of obvious royal residences or elite tombs strengthens this impression. Later civilizations leave unmistakable evidence of inequality. Lavish palaces dominate city centers. Powerful rulers are buried with gold weapons, elaborate jewelry, and valuable imports. Ordinary people receive much simpler treatment. At these earlier sacred places, however, such dramatic contrast remain largely absent. Archaeologists have not uncovered convincing evidence for kings living above everyone else. No throne room overlooks the sanctuary. No royal palace controls access to the sacred spaces. No monumental inscriptions glorify a ruling dynasty. This does not mean everyone enjoys identical influence. Leadership almost certainly exists. Large construction projects require coordination, decision-making, and respected authority. But authority appears to operate differently from the centralized political systems that will dominate later civilizations. Some anthropologists describe such arrangements as situational leadership. A skilled hunter leads the hunt. An experienced builder oversees construction. A respected ritual specialist guides ceremonies. Authority shifts according to circumstance rather than remaining permanently concentrated in one individual. Although the exact structure of these prehistoric communities remains uncertain, this flexible model aligns well with the archaeological evidence. One particularly fascinating question concerns children. For many years, prehistoric archaeology focuses primarily on adults, unintentionally overlooking younger members of society. More recent research increasingly recognizes that children play active roles in learning crafts, observing ceremonies, gathering resources, and transmitting cultural traditions. It is almost impossible to imagine these monumental projects without them. Young observers watch experienced artisans chip stone into precise shapes. They learn which animals migrate during different seasons. They memorize stories explaining why certain hills are sacred. They carry smaller tools, gather firewood, prepare food, and gradually absorb knowledge through participation rather than formal instruction. The sanctuary becomes a classroom extending across generations. Learning happens by doing. Every carved pillar therefore represents not only the labor of skilled adults, but also countless moments of teaching, imitation, and patient practice. Culture survives because each generation prepares the next. Women, too, almost certainly contribute far more than earlier archaeological interpretations once acknowledged. Older assumptions often portray monumental construction as exclusively male activity, yet growing evidence from many prehistoric societies suggests much broader participation in economic and ceremonial life. Food preparation for enormous gatherings alone requires extraordinary organization. Gathering wild plants, processing grains, producing textiles, crafting ornaments, caring for children, preserving oral traditions, and participating in rituals all contribute directly to the success of communal events. The archaeological record rarely identifies individual gender roles with certainty. Scholars therefore approach the question carefully. What survives in the record suggests complex communities where many forms of labour, both visible and invisible, sustain the ceremonial world. Another subtle clue emerges through the study of stone sources. The limestone used for pillars comes largely from nearby quarries, but other materials travel considerable distances. Obsidian from volcanic regions appears within the wider cultural network. Exotic stones and marine shells arrive through long-distance exchange. These discoveries reveal that the sanctuary does not exist in isolation. It belongs to a landscape connected through movement cooperation and communication extending far beyond the hill itself. People arrive carrying not only goods but ideas. Ideas evolve through repeated encounters. Repeated encounters strengthen shared traditions. Gradually, an increasingly interconnected cultural world begins taking shape across the ancient Near East. Viewed together, these fragments transform anonymous builders into recognizable human communities. They hunt, they celebrate, they teach, they travel, they carve, they remember. Above all, they cooperate in ways that challenge long-standing assumptions about the origins of civilization. The first sacred places are not simply architectural achievements. They are living centers where relationships are renewed year after year. And as archaeologists continue looking beyond the monuments toward the wider landscape, another realization begins to emerge. These remarkable sanctuaries are not isolated wonders standing alone against history. They belong to a much larger network of sacred places stretching across the ancient Near East, suggesting that an entire world of shared beliefs is quietly unfolding long before the first kingdoms ever rise. For many years, the great sanctuary on the limestone ridge dominates nearly every conversation about the earlier sacred architecture. Its towering pillars, remarkable age, and extraordinary carvings naturally capture worldwide attention. Yet archaeology has a habit of reminding researchers that history rarely revolves around a single place. The more excavations expand across the ancient Near East, the clearer another picture becomes. The sanctuary is exceptional. It is not entirely alone. Across southeastern Turkey, northern Syria, and neighbouring regions, archaeologists begin identifying other Neolithic sites that share surprising similarities. None are identical. Each possesses its own character, local traditions, and architectural choices. Together, however, they suggest that the first monumental sacred landscapes emerge from a broader cultural transformation, rather than appearing suddenly through one isolated act of inspiration. This realization changes the story once again. Instead of imagining one remarkable community inventing ceremonial architecture almost by accident, researchers increasingly see networks of people exchanging ideas across generations. Innovation spreads gradually shaped by countless local experiments, rather than a single revolutionary moment. Among the most important of these places is Karahantepe. Only in recent decades has large-scale excavation begun revealing its significance. Located not far from the more famous sanctuary, the site contains massive stone pillars, carefully planned architecture, carved human imagery, and impressive ceremonial spaces dating back to roughly the same broad period. Although much remains buried, Karahantepe immediately raises intriguing questions. Was it built by related communities? Did people travel regularly between these sacred centers? Did different sites serve different ceremonial purposes throughout the year? The evidence remains incomplete, but similarities are too striking to dismiss as coincidence. Stoneworking techniques resemble one another. Architectural planning reflects comparable ideas. Symbolic imagery shares important themes while retaining distinct local expressions. Rather than copying a single design exactly, communities appear to participate in a wider cultural tradition whose details evolve from place to place. This pattern feels remarkably familiar. Languages spread without every village speaking identical dialects. Musical traditions travel while developing regional styles. Religious customs often preserve shared foundations despite local variation. The earliest sacred landscapes may have functioned in much the same way. Every community contributes something unique while recognizing participation in a broader ceremonial world. Other nearby sites deepen this impression. Harbetsuvan Tepesi, Sefer Tepe Hamzan Tepe, and several additional locations continue producing evidence of monumental Neolithic activity. Some remain only partially excavated. Others are still being investigated through geophysical surveys before large-scale digging begins. Every new discovery expands the map. The ancient world grows more connected. Instead of isolated monuments standing like lonely islands across the landscape, archaeologists increasingly envision clusters of ceremonial centers linked through seasonal movement exchange networks, shared beliefs, and repeated human interaction. These connections are supported by more than architecture alone. Stone tools reveal similar manufacturing traditions across broad regions. Decorative objects display recurring artistic styles. Certain construction methods appear repeatedly despite considerable geographic separation. Knowledge itself seems to travel. Someone learns a new carving technique. That knowledge spreads through apprentices, relatives, marriage partners, or visiting craftspeople. Generations later, the technique appears hundreds of kilometers away. Ideas become as mobile as people. One particularly fascinating aspect of these sacred landscapes is their relationship with ordinary settlements. Modern cities usually separate monumental public buildings from residential neighborhoods through clear urban planning. Government centers occupy one district, homes another. Religious complexes stand apart from markets or administrative offices. The earliest ceremonial centers seem organized very differently. Some monumental sites contain surprisingly little evidence for permanent everyday occupation. There are relatively few domestic houses. Storage facilities remain limited. Large populations do not appear to live continuously around the monuments. Instead, many researchers suggest these places function primarily as gathering centers, visited periodically by communities living elsewhere. If correct, this interpretation transforms our understanding of prehistoric geography. Instead of a civilization centered upon cities, the landscape resembles a network of seasonal destinations. People spend much of the year dispersed across valleys, hills, and hunting territories. Then at important moments they converge. Ceremonies begin, feasts unfold, marriages strengthen alliances. Knowledge passes between generations. Construction continues. When the gatherings conclude, communities return home carrying renewed relationships and shared traditions back across the wider landscape. The sacred place becomes the thread binding distant groups together. This pattern may help explain why monumental architecture appears before urban life. Cities require permanent concentration of population. Sacred gathering places require periodic concentration of purpose. Those are very different forms of social organization. Recognizing this distinction represents one of archaeology's most important recent insights. It reminds us that human complexity does not begin with crowded streets or royal palaces. It begins wherever cooperation grows beyond the limits of individual families. Another remarkable feature linking these sites is their careful relationship with the natural landscape. Builders rarely choose locations at random. Many ceremonial centers occupy elevated ground overlooking wide valleys. Others stand near important water sources or along natural travel routes connecting different ecological zones. Visibility matters. Approaching travelers can see the monuments from considerable distances. Likewise, participants standing within the sanctuaries look outward across landscapes supporting their communities. The monuments become part of the land rather than separate from it. Architecture frames nature instead of replacing it. This sensitivity reflects a worldview shaped long before cities dominate human experience. People living primarily through hunting, gathering, and early cultivation understand landscapes as active participants in survival. Hills influence migration routes. Water determines seasonal movement. Rock formations become landmarks remembered across generations. Building sacred places within these settings strengthens rather than interrupts those relationships. Recent archaeological techniques continue revealing additional surprises. Ground-penetrating radar allows researchers to identify buried structures without immediate excavation. Magnetic surveys detect hidden walls, pits and enclosures invisible from the surface. Three-dimensional digital modeling reconstructs architectural layouts with extraordinary precision. These technologies demonstrate that many ceremonial landscapes extend far beyond the areas currently visible. In some cases, only a small fraction has been uncovered. The unseen remains larger than the seen. That reality encourages scientific humility. Popular imagination sometimes treats archaeology as though every important discovery has already been made. The evidence suggests otherwise. Each excavation season uncovers new buildings, unfamiliar carvings, unexpected construction phases, and subtle details capable of reshaping broader interpretations. The story remains unfinished. Perhaps the greatest lesson emerging from these wider landscapes concerns human creativity itself. Innovation rarely appears in complete form overnight. The first sacred places do not emerge because one brilliant individual suddenly invents monumental architecture. They evolve through countless experiments repeated across generations. Communities observe one another. Successful ideas spread. Local traditions adapt new practices without abandoning older beliefs. Gradually, entirely new cultural possibilities emerge. This cumulative process resembles evolution more than revolution. Small changes accumulate until the landscape itself begins looking different. By the time enormous stone sanctuaries dominate certain hilltops, thousands of earlier decisions, conversations, and shared experiences have already prepared the way. The monuments represent the visible peak of a much deeper cultural transformation. They also remind us that cooperation has geography. Ideas require places where people meet. Friendships require repeated encounters. Traditions require shared memories anchored to recognizable landscapes. The earliest ceremonial centers provide exactly those conditions. Long before roads connect kingdoms, invisible pathways already link sacred hills across the ancient Near East. Along those pathways travel not armies or merchants alone, but stories, symbols, techniques. Marriages, obligations, and beliefs powerful enough to unite communities that otherwise spend much of the year living far apart. Those beliefs, however, are about to become entangled with another profound transformation unfolding quietly across the same landscape. Humanity is beginning to change not only where it gathers, it is beginning to change how it feeds itself. For generations, archaeologists tell a remarkably straightforward story about the birth of civilization. First comes farming. Reliable harvests produce food surpluses. Surpluses support larger populations. Larger populations create permanent villages. Villages require leadership. Leadership evolves into governments, organized religion, and eventually kingdoms. It is an elegant sequence because each step appears to grow naturally from the one before it. Agriculture becomes the foundation upon which everything else is built. Then the earlier sacred places complicate the narrative. The massive ceremonial complexes emerging across the ancient Near East suggest that large-scale cooperation, sophisticated planning, and shared ritual already exist before farming becomes fully established. Instead of following agriculture, sacred architecture may actually accompany, or in some cases even precede, the transition toward cultivation. This possibility has sparked one of the most fascinating debates in modern archaeology. Did farming create temples, or did temples help create farming? The answer most researchers now believe is almost certainly more complicated than either extreme. Around 12,000 years ago, the people of Southwest Asia do not wake up one morning and suddenly become farmers. The transformation unfolds slowly across centuries, perhaps even millennia, with different communities experimenting in different ways. Many continue hunting gazelle while gathering wild cereals. Others begin intentionally encouraging the growth of useful plants. Some protect productive stands of grain from excessive disturbance. Others gradually favor seeds possessing characteristics more suitable for repeated harvesting. These small decisions accumulate almost invisibly. Generation after generation, people interact with plants in increasingly deliberate ways. Eventually, those interactions begin changing the plants themselves. The archaeological record preserves this transition through tiny details hidden inside ancient seeds. Wild wheat naturally disperses its grains when ripe, allowing reproduction without human assistance. Domesticated varieties develop tougher stalks that retain seeds until harvested, making collection far easier for people, but reducing the plant's ability to spread independently. This seemingly minor biological change represents one of the greatest turning points in human history. Yet it unfolds gradually. There is no single year when farming begins. Instead, countless small experiments slowly reshape both humanity and the natural world. The sacred places stand directly beside this transformation. Some scholars propose that large ceremonial gatherings create practical pressures, encouraging more dependable food supplies. Imagine hundreds of people assembling regularly at important sanctuaries. Feeding such gatherings requires planning. Wild resources alone may sometimes prove unpredictable. Communities capable of producing slightly more grain than usual gain advantages during major ceremonies. Over time, intentional cultivation becomes increasingly attractive. This idea, sometimes summarized as feasting drives farming, remains influential though far from universally accepted. The evidence supports parts of the hypothesis while leaving many uncertainties unresolved. No single explanation fully accounts for the remarkable complexity of the archaeological record. Other researchers reverse the relationship. Perhaps improving food production allows communities to remain longer in favored locations. Longer occupations strengthen attachment to sacred places. Monumental construction then becomes possible because larger populations spend more time together. In this interpretation, agriculture encourages ritual expansion rather than emerging because of it. Still others reject the search for a single cause entirely. Human societies rarely change for only one reason. Climate, population growth, technological innovation, social cooperation, ritual life, ecological opportunity, and simple chance all influence one another simultaneously. The beginnings of farming may therefore resemble a woven fabric rather than a straight line. Every thread strengthens the others. Recent archaeological discoveries increasingly support this more flexible perspective. Excavations reveal communities practicing mixed economies for surprisingly long periods. People cultivate certain plants while continuing extensive hunting. Wild resources remain important even after domesticated species appear. Early villages are anything but economically uniform. Adaptation remains the defining characteristic. This gradual blending of old and new ways of life makes perfect sense. Successful hunter-gatherers possess enormous environmental knowledge. They would have little reason to abandon effective survival strategies overnight. Instead, cultivation supplements existing practices. Only slowly does farming become dominant. Meanwhile, the ceremonial centers continue evolving. Some are expanded. Others are modified. New architectural forms appear. Old traditions persist alongside emerging innovations. Human culture proves remarkably capable of carrying multiple ideas at once. One particularly revealing discovery involves grinding stones. Large numbers of these heavy tools appear across Neolithic sites throughout the region. They are used to process wild cereals long before agriculture reaches full development. Grinding grain is therefore not an invention of farming communities. Instead, people already possess extensive experience collecting and preparing grasses growing naturally across the landscape. Domestication builds upon knowledge accumulated over countless generations. Innovation grows from familiarity rather than ignorance. The same pattern appears in animal domestication. Wild sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle remain central to human diets for thousands of years. Only gradually do some populations begin managing herds more deliberately. Selective breeding slowly transforms behavior, body size, and reproductive patterns. Again, there is no sudden revolution. Instead, human relationships with animals become increasingly intimate through repeated interaction. This broader perspective changes how the first sacred places are understood. Rather than standing at the end of one historical era or the beginning of another, they exist within a long transition connecting two worlds. Their builders inherit traditions reaching deep into the Ice Age. At the same time, they unknowingly prepare foundations for agricultural civilizations yet to come. They belong to both histories, and to neither completely. Perhaps this explains why the sanctuaries feel so difficult to categorize. They are neither purely nomadic nor fully urban, neither entirely prehistoric in the traditional sense nor recognizably part of later civilization. They occupy a threshold. Thresholds often produce creativity. Old assumptions weaken. New possibilities emerge. People experiment because familiar solutions no longer answer every challenge posed by a changing world. Climate continues stabilizing after the end of the Ice Age. Population slowly increases. Social networks expand. Communities gather more frequently. Food production becomes more intentional. Sacred landscapes grow increasingly elaborate. None of these developments happen in isolation. Each reinforces the others. Viewed together, they reveal one of humanity's greatest strengths. Adaptation is not merely about survival, it is about imagination. People notice opportunities invisible to previous generations. They reshape relationships with plants, animals, landscapes, and one another. Most importantly, they do so without abandoning the symbolic worlds that give meaning to their lives. Modern observers sometimes imagine practical needs and spiritual beliefs pulling in opposite directions. The archaeological evidence suggests something very different. For these early communities, growing food-sharing meals, honoring ancestors, observing seasonal change, constructing monuments, and maintaining social alliances likely form parts of a single interconnected way of living. The sacred does not interrupt everyday existence. It organizes it. Every harvest carries ceremonial significance. Every feast strengthens political relationships before politics exists in its later form. Every construction project reinforces identities extending far beyond individual families. By the time agriculture spreads more widely across the Fertile Crescent, humanity has already learned something equally important. People can cooperate on astonishing scales without kings commanding them. Shared belief proves capable of organizing labor long before centralized governments emerge. That lesson will echo throughout history, from the pyramids of Egypt to the great temples of Mesopotamia, from the stone circles of Europe to monumental religious architecture across the world. Later civilizations will often combine political authority with sacred purpose, yet beneath those famous monuments lies a much older inheritance. It begins on quiet hills where anonymous communities discover that belief itself can reshape landscapes, and although the great ceremonial centers eventually fall silent, their influence does not disappear. Instead, it becomes woven into every civilization that follows, often in ways their original builders could never have imagined. The idea appears almost impossible at first. How could people separated by thousands of kilometers living in vastly different environments and possessing no written communication create sacred places that seem to echo one another across continents? The answer is not that they share a single forgotten civilization. There is no credible archaeological evidence supporting the existence of one global prehistoric culture directing monumental construction around the world. The similarities emerge for a far more fascinating reason. Human beings, despite enormous cultural differences, often respond to the same challenges in surprisingly similar ways. As communities become larger and social relationships grow more complex, certain kinds of places begin appearing again and again. Places set apart from ordinary life. Places where memory is preserved. Places where ceremonies strengthen cooperation. Places where landscapes themselves become sacred. The earliest monumental sanctuaries of Southwest Asia belong to this wider human pattern, one that gradually unfolds across many regions, without requiring direct contact between all of them. In northeastern Africa, long before the pyramids dominate the Nile Valley, people are already transforming landscapes through ritual. The archaeological evidence is often more fragmentary than in Anatolia. Yet several prehistoric ceremonial locations reveal deliberate stone arrangements, burial traditions, and repeated use across generations. Communities living along ancient lakes, seasonal rivers, and fertile grasslands develop symbolic relationships with their surroundings that extend far beyond practical survival. The environments differ dramatically. The underlying human impulse feels familiar. Across parts of the Sahara, now one of the driest regions on Earth, the story becomes even more remarkable. Thousands of years ago, this immense desert looks completely different. The Green Sahara supports lakes, rivers, grasslands, and abundant wildlife. Hippopotamuses swim where endless sand dunes stand today. Crocodiles inhabit waterways now long vanished. Herds of antelope and cattle move across landscapes, receiving far more rainfall than the modern desert. Within these fertile environments, prehistoric communities create ceremonial sites, rock art, and burial monuments, reflecting sophisticated symbolic worlds. Many of these places remain poorly understood. Changing climate eventually transforms the region so dramatically that entire populations migrate toward more reliable water sources, especially the Nile Valley. Their sacred landscapes are abandoned, weathered by time, and in many cases buried beneath advancing sands. The pattern sounds strangely familiar. Changing climate, sacred gathering places, communities adapting to new worlds. The details differ, yet the rhythm resembles events unfolding farther east. In Europe, another expression of monumental ritual begins emerging several thousand years later. Here, agriculture has already spread across much of the continent, and societies organize themselves differently from the earlier hunter-gatherer communities of Anatolia. Even so, people once again invest extraordinary effort in constructing ceremonial landscapes. Long earthen enclosures appear. Massive stone tombs are built. Eventually, great stone circles rise across parts of Britain and northwestern Europe. It is tempting to imagine direct inheritance stretching all the way back to the earlier sanctuaries of Southwest Asia. The evidence does not support such a simple connection. Instead, archaeologists generally see these traditions as independent developments shaped by local conditions while sharing universal human tendencies. Communities everywhere need places where collective identity becomes visible. Monuments answer that need. One of the most striking similarities across these distant cultures is the relationship between sacred architecture and the sky. At many prehistoric ceremonial sites, builders pay careful attention to the movement of the sun, moon, or significant stars. Certain entrances align with solstice sunrise. Specific monuments frame seasonal events. Light itself becomes part of ceremonial experience. Researchers continue debating whether the earlier sanctuaries of southeastern Turkey intentionally incorporate astronomical alignments to the same degree seen at some later monuments. The evidence remains contested. Some proposed alignments appear convincing. Others may result from coincidence. Most archaeologists therefore approach astronomical interpretations cautiously, distinguishing between intriguing possibilities and firmly established conclusions. Even where intentional alignments remain uncertain, one broader observation seems secure. The sky matters. For prehistoric communities, celestial cycles provide reliable markers within constantly changing environments. The rising of particular stars helps predict seasonal migrations. The lengthening or shortening of daylight reflects approaching climatic shifts. Moon phases influence hunting travel and ritual timing. Watching the heavens is not merely spiritual, it is practical. Practical knowledge naturally acquires symbolic importance. The same pattern appears in relationships with mountains, rivers, caves, and forests. Across continents, sacred places often emerge where unusual landscapes already command attention. Towering cliffs inspire awe. Natural springs sustain life. Caves invite mystery. Prominent hills become landmarks visible for great distances. Rather than dominating nature, early ceremonial architecture frequently collaborates with it. Builders enhance locations already carrying emotional significance. This approach differs noticeably from many later imperial monuments. Kings often reshape landscapes to demonstrate political power. Canals redirect rivers. Massive platforms level hills. Entire cities are designed according to administrative priorities. The earlier sacred places display a more balanced relationship. Architecture grows from the land instead of overwhelming it. This distinction reflects fundamentally different social worlds. Communities still living close to seasonal rhythms rarely separate themselves completely from natural systems. Their ceremonies reinforce dependence upon those systems rather than claiming mastery over them. Another fascinating comparison comes from ancient Australia. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal peoples maintain extraordinarily rich ceremonial traditions connected to specific landscapes. Sacred sites preserve ancestral stories passed orally across immense spans of time. Stone arrangements, ceremonial grounds, and songlines transform geography into living memory. Although these traditions develop independently from those of Southwest Asia, they demonstrate another profound truth. Monumentality is not the only expression of sacred space. Sometimes stories themselves become monuments. A hill gains meaning because generations remember it. A waterhole becomes sacred through repeated ceremony. An invisible pathway carries greater cultural weight than any physical building. This broader perspective reminds archaeologists not to measure prehistoric complexity solely through surviving stone. Wood decays, textiles disappear, songs leave no fossil record, entire ceremonial traditions vanish without obvious archaeological traces. What survives is only a fraction of what once existed. The monumental sanctuaries of the Fertile Crescent are therefore both exceptional and fortunate. Their limestone pillars endure long enough to preserve glimpses of symbolic worlds that countless other societies express through more fragile materials. Had those builders relied primarily upon timber instead of stone, modern humanity might never have known they existed at all. This realization encourages humility. The archaeological record is not a complete archive. It is a collection shaped by survival. Some civilizations leave enormous monuments. Others disappear almost entirely despite equal cultural richness. Stone favors remembrance. Organic materials often favor oblivion. Across every continent, however, one pattern continues emerging. Human communities repeatedly create places where ordinary existence pauses, where families become something larger than themselves, where landscapes acquire shared meaning, where memory extends beyond individual lifetimes, whether marked by towering pillars, circles of stone, sacred caves, painted cliffs, or carefully maintained ceremonial grounds. These places perform remarkably similar social functions. They transform groups of people into communities united by common stories. The first monumental sanctuaries built before kings exist are therefore not isolated historical curiosities. They represent one expression of an enduring human instinct, the instinct to gather, to remember, to celebrate, to mourn, to cooperate, to locate meaning within the landscapes that sustain life. Yet every sacred place, no matter how important, eventually faces the same challenge. The world changes, climate shifts, economies evolve, communities move, beliefs transform, and sooner or later even the holiest landscapes must confront the possibility that the people who built them will one day stop returning. At first, the changes are almost impossible to notice. The ceremonies continue. Hunters still arrive along familiar pathways. Fires are lit in the great gathering places. Stone vessels are filled. Children learn the stories attached to the towering pillars, just as their parents once did. The rhythms that have shaped generations seem as permanent as the limestone itself. Yet beneath these familiar routines, the world is quietly shifting. Across the Fertile Crescent, farming gradually becomes more reliable. Fields that once supplement wild resources begin providing a greater share of everyday food. Villages grow larger and remain occupied throughout the year rather than only during certain seasons. Houses become more substantial. Storage buildings appear with increasing frequency, as harvested grain must be protected from weather insects and animals. People begin spending more of their lives in one place. This seemingly simple change alters almost everything. A community living together throughout the entire year develops different priorities from one gathering only during important seasons. Daily cooperation replaces periodic cooperation. Decisions about land, water, property, and harvests become increasingly important. Children grow up surrounded by the same neighbors instead of meeting distant communities only during annual ceremonies. The center of social life begins moving, not suddenly, not completely, but steadily. The great ceremonial hills are no longer the only places where identity is created. Permanent villages begin generating identities of their own. This transformation may help explain one of archaeology's most intriguing observations. The enormous ceremonial centers eventually stop expanding. New monumental enclosures become less common. Construction techniques change. Some traditions continue while others quietly fade. The sacred does not disappear. Its location begins changing. One of the clearest examples of this broader transition appears at sites such as Çatalhöyük, several thousand years after the earlier sanctuaries flourish. Unlike the monumental gathering places of southeastern Turkey, Çatalhöyük consists of a densely packed settlement where thousands of people live in closely connected houses. Families enter their homes through openings in the roofs. Walls display elaborate paintings. Ancestors are buried beneath domestic floors. Here ritual becomes woven directly into everyday life. There is no sharp boundary separating sacred architecture from ordinary houses. Instead, homes themselves become places of memory. The dead remain physically close to the living. Ceremonial symbols appear inside domestic spaces. Daily existence and spiritual life become inseparable. This represents a profound cultural shift. Earlier ceremonial centers draw dispersed communities together at specific times. Later villages internalize many of those same symbolic functions. The sacred landscape gradually moves indoors. Scholars continue debating exactly how these developments relate to one another. No direct line connects every site. Different communities follow different historical paths. Nevertheless, the overall trend is difficult to ignore. As settlement becomes increasingly permanent, monumental gathering places lose some of the unique role they once play. People no longer need to travel as far to reinforce community identity. Their community now surrounds them every day. Another important change concerns leadership. Larger permanent settlements inevitably create new social challenges. Disagreements over land become more significant. Stored food requires protection. Construction projects become continuous rather than seasonal. Trade expands. Population density increases. Although early farming villages often remain surprisingly egalitarian by later standards, opportunities for social inequality gradually become more common. Certain families accumulate greater influence. Some individuals control access to valuable resources. Specialized crafts become increasingly important. The foundations of later political systems begin forming almost invisibly. Nothing like the powerful kings of Mesopotamia exists yet, but the social world is changing in directions that will eventually make kingdoms possible. Ironically, the earlier sacred places emerge before this transformation reaches full strength. Their builders demonstrate that extraordinary cooperation is possible without centralized political authority. Later, civilizations often achieve even grander architectural accomplishments, but they frequently do so through systems involving taxation, organized labor, administrative bureaucracy, and hereditary rulers. The methods change. The monuments remain. This distinction gives the first sanctuaries their unique place in history. They belong to a brief moment when collective belief alone appears capable of organizing astonishing public works. Then comes another mystery. Many of the great enclosures are not left to crumble naturally. They are deliberately buried. The process is careful, intentional, respectful. Massive quantities of soil, broken limestone tools, animal bones, and other materials are placed inside the circular structures until the towering pillars disappear beneath the surface. Why? The question has fascinated archaeologists since excavation began. One possibility suggests ritual closure. Sacred spaces often possess life cycles. Just as ceremonies have beginnings and endings, buildings themselves may eventually complete their purpose. Rather than abandoning them carelessly, communities ceremonially retire them. Burial becomes an act of respect rather than destruction. Another interpretation emphasizes practical change. As villages become more permanent elsewhere, maintaining enormous seasonal gathering centers may no longer justify the tremendous investment of labor. Communities choose to conclude one tradition while developing another. The sanctuaries are closed because society itself is evolving. Still another possibility focuses upon memory. Covering the monuments protects them. Unlike violent destruction, careful burial preserves much of the architecture beneath layers of earth. Whether intentionally or not, this process allows the carvings to survive thousands of years longer than they otherwise might have. The builders may never imagine future archaeologists uncovering their work, yet their actions make exactly that discovery possible. The evidence remains incomplete. No written explanation survives. No oral tradition reaches across 11 millennia to describe the final ceremonies. The silence surrounding the burial is itself part of the mystery. Perhaps different enclosures are buried for different reasons. Perhaps beliefs evolve gradually rather than through one dramatic event. Perhaps generations participate without fully understanding why their ancestors begin the practice. Human traditions often continue long after their original meanings have faded. Whatever the reason, the decision marks the closing of an extraordinary chapter. The great circles disappear beneath the ground. Grass slowly grows across the newly formed mounds. Rain smooths the surface. Passing centuries erase visible traces. The hill returns to the landscape. Only those who know its stories would remember what lies below. Then eventually no one remembers at all. Elsewhere, human history accelerates. Agriculture spreads into Europe. Villages become towns. Metallurgy transforms technology. Writing emerges in Mesopotamia. Kings appear. Empires rise. The monumental sanctuaries built before all of these developments vanish so completely that later civilizations construct entirely new sacred traditions without realizing an older chapter once existed beneath the soil. Yet disappearance is not the same as failure. The earlier ceremonial landscapes accomplish something far more enduring than preserving their own visibility. They demonstrate possibilities. They prove that strangers can cooperate peacefully. That shared belief can organize enormous projects. That architecture can shape identity. That landscapes can become repositories of collective memory. These ideas do not vanish with the buried pillars. They continue evolving inside every civilization that follows. Temples become larger. Priesthoods become more formal. Religious systems become increasingly complex. Political authority intertwines with sacred authority. But underneath those later developments lies an older inheritance created by anonymous communities who gather on windswept hills long before anyone imagines crowns or empires. The sanctuaries disappear from sight. Their influence does not. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this. By burying their monuments instead of abandoning them to slow destruction, those prehistoric builders unknowingly preserve one of humanity's earliest chapters until a distant future is finally ready to read it again. The earth keeps secrets with remarkable patience. For more than 100 centuries rain falls upon the buried sanctuaries. Seasons turn without interruption. Countless generations walk above the hidden pillars, unaware that immense stone figures stand only a short distance beneath their feet. Kingdoms appear and disappear. Entire religions rise, flourish, divide, and transform. Languages are born, evolve, and vanish. Through it all, the carefully buried ceremonial circles remain sealed inside the hill, protected by the very soil that once concealed them. When archaeologists finally begin uncovering these forgotten places, they recover far more than architecture. They recover questions. Some of those questions have clear scientific answers. Others continue resisting every attempt at explanation. The greatest mysteries surrounding the first sacred places are not dramatic legends about vanished super-civilizations or mysterious lost technologies. They are quieter, subtler puzzles emerging directly from the evidence itself. The first mystery concerns motivation. Why build monuments at all? Even after decades of excavation, researchers still cannot identify one practical necessity capable of explaining the enormous investment of labor. The sanctuaries are not defensive forts. They contain no walls designed to repel attackers. They are not ordinary settlements packed with houses. They are not storage complexes built to protect harvests, nor do they function as royal palaces. Instead, they occupy a category that seems almost entirely devoted to shared symbolic life. Modern societies sometimes underestimate the power of collective belief because political and economic institutions dominate so much of public life. The prehistoric builders remind us that meaning itself can become a powerful organizing force. Communities are willing to quarry, stone transport massive pillars, carve intricate reliefs, prepare enormous feasts and return generation after generation, because these activities reinforce identities larger than any individual household. Exactly what those identities are remains uncertain. That uncertainty leads directly to another enduring mystery. Who is represented by the great T-shaped pillars? At first glance they appear abstract. Then the carved arms become visible. The belts, the carefully shaped hands. Suddenly the realization emerges that these towering stones probably depict human forms, but whose? Some archaeologists see revered ancestors whose continuing presence binds generations together. Others propose supernatural beings standing at the center of ceremonial life. A few suggest highly respected ritual specialists transformed into symbolic figures rather than literal portraits. Each possibility finds some support. None commands universal agreement. Without written texts, the pillars remain silent witnesses refusing to identify themselves. The mystery deepens when attention turns toward the extraordinary animal carvings. Why do foxes appear so frequently? Why are snakes given such prominence? Why do vultures recur alongside dangerous predators? Were these creatures chosen because they dominate local ecosystems, because they belong to forgotten myths, because they symbolize social groups, or because they represent forces connecting humanity with unseen worlds? Every interpretation reveals something plausible. Every interpretation leaves important questions unanswered. No single explanation fully accounts for the remarkable variety displayed across different enclosures. Perhaps there never was one universal meaning. Different ceremonies may emphasize different animals. Different communities may understand the same symbols differently. Cultures are rarely as uniform as modern observers sometimes imagine. One particularly intriguing discovery has generated considerable discussion among specialists. Several carved symbols appear repeatedly across multiple pillars. These abstract markings resemble neither realistic animals nor obvious decorative patterns. Their repetition strongly suggests intentional communication. Could they represent an early symbolic system approaching writing? Most archaeologists advise caution. True writing records spoken language systematically. Nothing currently demonstrates that these carvings perform such a function. Even so, repeated abstract signs reveal minds comfortable expressing ideas through stable visual symbols. They occupy a fascinating space between simple decoration and formal script. Perhaps they belong to ritual knowledge shared orally. Perhaps they identify particular ceremonies. Perhaps they indicate directions, clans, seasons, or cosmological concepts impossible to reconstruct today. Their precise meaning remains one of the great unanswered questions of prehistoric archaeology. Another mystery lies hidden beneath the monuments themselves. Excavations reveal multiple construction phases extending across centuries. Older enclosures are deliberately buried. New ones are built nearby, Architectural styles evolve while preserving certain core traditions. Why continue rebuilding instead of simply maintaining existing structures? One possibility emphasizes renewal. Many religious traditions throughout history incorporate cycles of creation, transformation, and ceremonial replacement. Building a new sanctuary may itself represent an act of spiritual significance. Another explanation points toward changing social circumstances. Communities grow, relationships shift, new ceremonial needs emerge. Architecture adapts accordingly. Again, certainty remains elusive. Perhaps the most fundamental mystery concerns organization. How do relatively small prehistoric communities coordinate projects requiring hundreds of participants? No written administrative records survive. No tax lists, no construction contracts, no official plans. Yet every excavated enclosure demonstrates careful design. Measurements remain surprisingly consistent. Pillars fit within coherent architectural layouts. Quarrying follows systematic methods. Nothing suggests chaotic improvisation. Knowledge exists, leadership exists, planning exists. Their precise forms simply differ from the bureaucratic systems familiar from later civilizations. Anthropologists increasingly suggest that prehistoric societies possess sophisticated organizational abilities long before states emerge. Consensus reputation, kinship, ritual obligation, and seasonal cooperation may accomplish far more than earlier scholars once believed possible. This insight reaches far beyond archaeology. It challenges assumptions about human nature itself. Complexity does not automatically require authoritarian government. People have many ways of organizing themselves. The first sacred places preserve evidence of one such alternative. Another unresolved puzzle concerns the apparent absence of violence. The wider prehistoric world certainly experiences conflict at times. Human societies have never been completely free of competition or warfare. Yet the ceremonial centers themselves display surprisingly little evidence of fortification. No defensive walls dominate the sacred spaces. Weapons are relatively uncommon compared with later settlements. This does not prove perfect peace. It does suggest that cooperation outweighs conflict during at least certain phases of these gatherings. Sacred landscapes may function partly because they provide neutral ground where otherwise independent communities can strengthen relationships instead of weakening them. If so, these monuments preserve one of humanity's earliest successful experiments in large-scale social integration. Climate introduces another layer of uncertainty. Researchers continue studying how environmental changes influence the rise and transformation of these ceremonial traditions. The end of the Ice Age creates more favorable conditions across much of the region. Later climatic fluctuations affect water availability, vegetation, and settlement patterns. Exactly how these environmental shifts interact with cultural decisions remains an active area of research. Nature shapes history. History also reshapes human relationships with nature. The two cannot easily be separated. Every excavation season adds fresh pieces to this remarkable puzzle. Advanced microscopic analysis reveals traces invisible to earlier researchers. Ancient DNA provides unexpected insights into population movement. Chemical studies reconstruct diets with increasing precision. Ground-penetrating technologies identify buried architecture waiting beneath untouched soil. The picture becomes clearer. The mystery does not disappear. Perhaps that balance explains why these first sacred places continue captivating scholars and the public alike. They offer genuine discoveries without pretending every question has already been answered. They invite curiosity while rewarding patience. Most importantly, they remind us that the earliest builders are not primitive people standing at the edge of civilization. They are fully human communities confronting profound environmental change with creativity, cooperation, imagination, and extraordinary determination. Their world remains partly hidden, but each newly uncovered pillar brings us a little closer to understanding how humanity first learned to transform shared belief into enduring stone. The first sacred places disappear from memory. Their builders leave no written chronicles. Their languages fade before anyone invents an alphabet capable of preserving them. The ceremonies end, the monuments are buried, and the hills gradually blend back into the ordinary landscape. On the surface, it seems as though the tradition has come to a complete and irreversible end. Yet history is rarely so simple. Ideas often survive long after the societies that first imagined them have vanished. Not because later civilizations remember every detail, but because certain ways of thinking prove remarkably resilient. Human communities repeatedly rediscover patterns that answer the same fundamental needs, remembering the dead marking sacred space, gathering dispersed populations and giving visible form to invisible beliefs. The first monumental sanctuaries may disappear. The instinct that created them does not. This is one of the most difficult subjects for archaeologists to approach, because it lies at the boundary between evidence and interpretation. Direct cultural continuity stretching across many thousands of years is extraordinarily difficult to prove. Languages change, populations move, belief systems evolve, entire traditions merge, divide, or disappear. Responsible scholarship therefore avoids claiming that later religions simply inherit the ceremonial practices of the earlier sanctuaries. The evidence does not support such a straightforward conclusion. Instead, researchers ask a more careful question. Which fundamental ideas continue appearing throughout later human history? One of the clearest examples is the concept of sacred geography. The earliest ceremonial builders choose particular hills, ridges, and prominent landscapes rather than constructing monuments anywhere at random. Certain places become meaningful because generations repeatedly return to them. Thousands of years later, this pattern remains astonishingly familiar. Ancient Mesopotamian cities place their temples on elevated platforms dominating the surrounding landscape. Egyptian sanctuaries are carefully integrated into the geography of the Nile Valley. Greek temples crown hilltops overlooking entire regions. Across Europe, many medieval churches are built upon sites already considered significant long before Christianity arrives. This does not necessarily mean each location shares direct historical continuity. Rather, it reveals a recurring human tendency. When communities identify places carrying exceptional meaning, later generations often preserve that importance, even while transforming the beliefs associated with it. The landscape remembers even when people forget why. Another striking continuity involves the relationship between ancestors and community identity. Although the precise role of ancestors within the earlier sanctuaries remains uncertain, archaeology increasingly demonstrates that memory of previous generations becomes central to many later Neolithic societies. At settlements such as Çatalhöyük, individuals are buried beneath house floors. Families literally live above their ancestors. Death does not remove people entirely from everyday existence. Instead, memory remains physically embedded within domestic life. Centuries later, burial monuments become increasingly elaborate across many regions of the world. Megalithic tombs appear throughout Western Europe. Royal burial complexes dominate ancient Egypt. Monumental cemeteries emerge in countless civilizations. The forms differ enormously. The underlying concern remains familiar. How should the living maintain relationships with those who came before them? The earliest sacred places may represent one of humanity's first large-scale attempts to answer that timeless question. Communal gathering also proves remarkably durable. Long before kingdoms establish administrative capitals, people understand that societies require moments when scattered families become one larger community. Harvest festivals, seasonal ceremonies, pilgrimages, religious processions, market fairs connected to sacred observances. These practices appear repeatedly across cultures separated by immense distances and spans of time. They accomplish practical goals while simultaneously reinforcing shared identity. The first monumental sanctuaries demonstrate this principle with extraordinary clarity. The gathering itself may be just as important as whatever rituals take place once everyone arrives. architecture contributes another enduring legacy. The builders of the earlier ceremonial circles discover something profoundly important. Physical space shapes human experience. Standing beneath towering pillars produces different emotions from standing in an open field. Walking through carefully arranged enclosures focuses attention. Monumental scale encourages reflection, reverence, and perhaps even humility. Later civilizations expand this insight dramatically. Egyptian temple avenues guide visitors toward increasingly restricted sacred spaces. Mesopotamian ziggurats elevate shrines above surrounding cities. Greek temples combine proportion light and landscape into carefully orchestrated experiences. Gothic cathedrals eventually use soaring ceilings and coloured glass to inspire awe. The architectural vocabulary changes. The psychological principle remains remarkably consistent. Buildings influence thought. The earliest sanctuary builders understand this long before architecture becomes a formal discipline. Another continuity lies in symbolism. Foxes, vultures, snakes, and wild boar carved upon prehistoric pillars rarely reappear in identical forms within later religions. Nevertheless, animals continue serving as powerful symbolic figures across countless civilizations. The falcon becomes associated with divine kingship in Egypt. The lion symbolizes strength and authority across the ancient Near East. Serpents acquire complex meanings involving wisdom, renewal, danger, healing, or cosmic power depending upon cultural context. Animals remain bridges between humanity and larger natural or spiritual worlds. This enduring symbolic relationship reminds us that human imagination evolves gradually. Entire systems of belief rarely emerge from nothing. They grow through centuries of accumulated observation, storytelling, and shared experience. Perhaps the most significant inheritance concerns cooperation itself. The first sacred places demonstrate that human beings can organize extraordinary collective effort around ideas rather than coercion alone. This lesson echoes repeatedly through history. Many of the world's greatest monuments require enormous coordination. Some are undoubtedly built under powerful rulers. Others emerge through voluntary communal labor motivated by religious devotion, civic pride, or shared cultural identity. Both models become part of humanity's story. The prehistoric sanctuaries preserve one of the earliest surviving examples of the second. Of course, continuity has limits. By the time written history begins in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, the world has changed profoundly. Cities dominate river valleys. Writing records taxes, trade myths, and royal decrees. Professional priesthoods oversee increasingly formal religious institutions. Political authority and sacred authority often become closely intertwined. The anonymous ceremonial communities of 11,000 years earlier belong to a very different historical landscape. No evidence suggests direct institutional survival across that immense span of time. Instead, what survives are broader human patterns: sacred space, shared memory, monumental architecture, communal gathering, symbolic landscapes, respect for ancestors, the search for meaning beyond ordinary survival. These themes reappear because they answer enduring aspects of the human condition, rather than because one uninterrupted tradition passes unchanged through millennia. Perhaps that distinction makes the earlier sanctuaries even more remarkable. They do not merely precede civilization chronologically, they reveal capacities already present within humanity long before cities' writing or kings provide them with new forms of expression. Looking across the entire sweep of history, it becomes increasingly difficult to see the first sacred places as isolated prehistoric curiosities. Instead, they resemble the opening movements of a much longer composition. Later civilizations introduce new instruments, different rhythms, different languages, different beliefs. Yet somewhere beneath all those variations remains a quiet, familiar melody. People gather. They remember, they build, they search for connections between themselves, their ancestors, the natural world, and whatever they believe lies beyond it. The first builders never know how long that melody will continue. But thousands of years later, their silent stone circles still remind us where one of humanity's oldest songs may have begun. There is something strangely humbling about standing beside a monument whose creators never expect anyone outside their own world to understand it. Most civilizations that leave written records also leave instructions for future generations. Kings carve victories into stone so their names will be remembered. Priests record ceremonies, myths and genealogies. Merchants keep accounts. Administrators preserve laws. Even when languages are eventually forgotten, scholars often recover enough fragments to reconstruct large portions of those ancient worlds. The first sacred places offer no such guidance. Their builders leave architecture instead of literature. Every carved pillar becomes a sentence. Every enclosure becomes a chapter. Yet the language itself has vanished. Modern archaeology therefore works in reverse. Instead of reading ancient explanations and confirming them with physical evidence, researchers begin with the physical evidence and cautiously build possible explanations from it. Every interpretation must remain open to revision because a single new discovery can change the broader picture. This is not a weakness of archaeology. It is one of its greatest strengths. Unlike legends, archaeology allows uncertainty to remain visible. When the evidence is incomplete, responsible researchers acknowledge that incompleteness rather than replacing it with certainty. The first sacred places provide a perfect example. Consider the remarkable stone pillars. Their T-shaped forms clearly differ from ordinary building supports. Their carved arms, hands, belts, and loincloths strongly suggest stylized human figures. Beyond those broad observations, however, interpretation becomes increasingly difficult. Do they represent gods? Perhaps. Do they represent ancestors? Possibly. Do they symbolize mythical beings existing somewhere between humanity and the natural world? That too remains conceivable. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. Each possibility illuminates part of the evidence while leaving important questions unanswered. The same careful balance applies to the animal carvings. Early interpretations often attempt to identify one universal symbolic meaning for each species. Fox equals one concept. Vulture equals another. Snake equals something else. Human cultures rarely operate with such simplicity. Symbols often possess multiple meanings depending upon context. A single animal may represent danger during one ceremony, renewal during another, and ancestral identity in a different setting altogether. Modern societies behave similarly. A national flag carries different emotional meanings during celebration, mourning, protest, or remembrance. Its significance changes according to circumstance while remaining recognizably the same symbol. The prehistoric builders likely think in equally complex ways. Another enduring mystery concerns the apparent absence of domestic life within many ceremonial areas. Excavations uncover monumental architecture, feasting debris-carved sculpture and ritual features. They uncover comparatively few ordinary houses. This suggests that the sanctuaries are visited rather than permanently inhabited. Yet archaeologists continue debating exactly how these visits are organized. How often do gatherings occur? Every season? Every year? Only during major environmental events? Different enclosures may even serve different purposes across different times of the year. The archaeological record preserves the destination. It preserves almost nothing about the schedule. That silence forces researchers to combine environmental evidence, ethnographic comparison, and careful reasoning without pretending certainty where none exists. Climate research has become especially important in recent years. Highly detailed analyses of ancient pollen lake sediments, tree rings, and ice cores allow scientists to reconstruct environmental conditions with increasing precision. These studies reveal that the end of the Ice Age is not a smooth transition. Short periods of renewed cooling interrupt the general warming trend. Rainfall patterns fluctuate. Vegetation expands and contracts. Animal populations respond accordingly. Communities living through these centuries experience a world that remains dynamic rather than stable. This environmental complexity may help explain why shared ceremonial traditions become so valuable. When landscapes change unpredictably, social cooperation provides security. Communities connected through ritual networks are better positioned to exchange knowledge, resources, and assistance during difficult years. In that sense, the monuments may preserve not only religious life but also resilience. One of the most exciting developments in modern archaeology involves ancient DNA. Over the last 2 decades, genetic analysis has transformed understanding of prehistoric populations throughout Eurasia. Researchers can now trace broad patterns of migration ancestry and population interaction with remarkable accuracy. These discoveries complement rather than replace archaeology. Genes reveal biological relationships. Architecture reveals cultural choices. The two do not always move together. People sometimes adopt new ideas without major population replacement. In other cases, migration spreads both genes and cultural traditions. The earliest ceremonial landscapes emerge within precisely this complex world of interaction. Communities are connected. They are not identical. Shared traditions spread while local identities remain distinct. Ground-penetrating technologies are producing equally dramatic advances. Many areas surrounding the known sanctuaries remain unexcavated. Magnetic surveys reveal buried walls invisible from the surface. Electrical resistance mapping identifies hidden features without disturbing the soil. 3-dimensional digital reconstructions allow archaeologists to visualize entire architectural complexes before extensive excavation even begins. These methods consistently produce one surprising result. The known monuments represent only part of the story. Much remains underground. Every excavation opens only a small window into a much larger prehistoric landscape. This fact encourages caution whenever sweeping conclusions are proposed. Popular documentaries sometimes present archaeological discoveries as though final answers have already been reached. Real research rarely works that way. Instead, understanding grows gradually. One carefully excavated enclosure modifies earlier theories. A newly discovered quarry changes assumptions about construction. Microscopic residue analysis reveals unexpected food preparation techniques. Ancient pollen alters interpretations of local vegetation. Knowledge expands through accumulation rather than dramatic revelation. Perhaps the most valuable lesson offered by the first sacred places is methodological rather than historical. They remind us how easily confident assumptions can be overturned. Only a few decades ago, the dominant model of civilization appeared straightforward. Agriculture first, temples second. The discovery of monumental ceremonial architecture predating fully developed farming communities forces scholars to rethink that sequence. Science advances not because old ideas are defended forever, but because evidence remains capable of changing them. The buried sanctuaries demonstrate exactly that process. Their builders unknowingly challenge archaeologists separated from them by 11,000 years. Every newly uncovered pillar asks the same quiet question: what if the story begins differently than we imagined? It is a question worth asking not only about prehistoric religion, but about human history as a whole. Complex societies rarely emerge through simple formulas. Culture evolves through countless interactions among environment, technology, belief, cooperation, and imagination. The earliest sacred places stand at one of those remarkable intersections. They belong to a world where none of those forces can be separated cleanly from the others. The deeper archaeologists dig into the limestone hills, the more that world comes back into view. Not completely, perhaps never completely, but enough to recognize that long before humanity records its history, it is already creating landscapes of astonishing sophistication, profound symbolism, and enduring mystery. Looking across the long sweep of human history, it becomes surprisingly easy to focus only on the civilizations that leave behind towering palaces, written chronicles, and the names of famous rulers. Ancient Egypt offers pharaohs whose monuments still dominate the Nile. Mesopotamia preserves kings who proudly record military victories on clay tablets and stone stelae. Later empires fill museums with statues, inscriptions, coins, and official histories that allow modern scholars to reconstruct political events in remarkable detail. Against such familiar civilizations, the first sacred places might seem almost like a forgotten preface. They belong to people whose names are lost. Their language disappears before writing exists. Their ceremonies leave no surviving prayers. Their beliefs remain visible only through architecture, carved stone, and fragments of everyday life. Yet the deeper archaeology explores these earlier sanctuaries, the more their importance grows. They do not merely come before civilization. They help explain how civilization becomes possible. One of the oldest assumptions in historical thinking holds that powerful rulers create large societies. Kings command labor, governments organize construction, administrative systems produce order. Religion follows political authority. The first monumental sanctuaries suggest another possibility. Perhaps large communities first learned to cooperate around shared beliefs rather than shared governments. This distinction is subtle but profound. Political institutions certainly become essential later. No great Bronze Age kingdom could function without administration, taxation, and centralized leadership. But before those systems exist, humanity already demonstrates an extraordinary capacity for coordinated action. The earlier ceremonial landscapes preserve evidence of cooperation before bureaucracy. That realization changes how the origins of civilization are understood. Rather than appearing suddenly through the rise of kings, civilization increasingly resembles the gradual accumulation of social skills. Communities learn to trust strangers. They establish seasonal meeting places. They exchange resources across expanding networks. They preserve knowledge through generations. They organize labor voluntarily around projects larger than any individual family. These achievements are not separate from civilization. They are among its foundations. Another enduring legacy concerns memory. The first sacred builders understand something every later civilization will rediscover. People need physical places where collective memory can live. Stories survive more easily when attached to recognizable landscapes. A hill becomes sacred because ancestors gather there. A circle of stones reminds every generation of ceremonies performed before their own births. Architecture anchors tradition. Later civilizations expand this principle dramatically. Temple complexes become centers of education. Royal tombs preserve dynastic legitimacy. Cathedrals shape urban identity. National memorials commemorate sacrifice. Modern museums protect cultural heritage. Different societies choose different forms, yet all reflect the same underlying realization. Memory requires places. The prehistoric sanctuaries reveal this truth at an astonishingly early moment in human history. Their builders possess no archives. Stone becomes the archive. Another lesson emerges from the remarkable relationship between humanity and the natural world. Modern cities often create the impression that civilization exists separately from nature. Concrete replaces forests, roads cross rivers, artificial lighting overwhelms the night sky. The earlier ceremonial landscapes reveal a dramatically different perspective. The monuments rarely dominate the environment through overwhelming scale alone. Instead, they cooperate with hills, valleys, seasonal movement, and open skies. Standing within one of the stone circles, participants remain constantly aware of wind-changing sunlight, distant animals, and surrounding terrain. Nature is not excluded from ceremony. Nature participates in it. This relationship gradually changes as cities grow larger and more permanent. Even so, echoes remain visible throughout later history. Ancient temples continue aligning with mountains or rivers. Sacred groves survive beside monumental architecture. Pilgrimage routes often follow natural landscapes already carrying deep cultural meaning. The first sacred places establish a pattern that never entirely disappears. The builders also leave behind an unexpected lesson about leadership. History often celebrates individuals. Alexander, Augustus, Qin Shi Huang, Ramses. Names become symbols of entire eras. The earliest sanctuaries offer no equivalent figures. No famous architect signs the pillars. No ruler claims responsibility for construction. The achievements belong to communities rather than personalities. Modern observers sometimes find this anonymity frustrating. Who deserves the credit? The answer may simply be everyone. Thousands of unnamed people contribute across generations. Stoneworkers, hunters, gatherers, children learning essential skills, elders preserving stories, individuals preparing communal meals, craftspeople shaping tools. Knowledge survives because it belongs to the community instead of one extraordinary individual. This collective authorship feels surprisingly modern despite its great antiquity. It reminds us that many of humanity's greatest accomplishments emerge through cooperation rather than personal glory. Scientific research into these sanctuaries continues expanding every year. Only a fraction of the known archaeological landscape has been excavated. New discoveries regularly reshape existing interpretations. Previously unknown ceremonial centres continue emerging through survey work. Laboratory techniques reveal microscopic evidence invisible to earlier generations of researchers. The story remains unfinished. Future archaeologists will almost certainly understand these sites differently than scholars do today. That continuing evolution of knowledge is itself part of the legacy. The first sacred places teach humility. Every confident historical model must remain open to revision. Evidence has the final word. Perhaps the most moving aspect of these monuments is their quiet humanity. Nothing about them depends upon spectacular technology. No metal cranes lift the pillars. No advanced machines carve the limestone. No written engineering manuals guide construction. Instead, patient hands shape every surface. Generations inherit specialized knowledge. Communities gather because they believe certain places matter deeply. The monuments emerge through persistence rather than miracle. That persistence still speaks across 11,000 years. Standing among the pillars today, visitors encounter not an alien civilization but recognizable human intentions. The desire to belong, the desire to remember, the desire to connect everyday life with something larger than oneself. These motivations remain astonishingly familiar. Modern societies express them differently. We build memorials, museums, places of worship, public squares, universities and monuments dedicated to shared ideals. The forms have changed beyond recognition. The underlying impulses have not. The earlier sanctuary builders could never imagine satellites orbiting Earth, or archaeologists using lasers to map buried architecture. Likewise, modern humanity can scarcely imagine the emotional world experienced by people living at the close of the Ice Age. Yet between those distant worlds stands a bridge built not from technology but from shared humanity. Across thousands of generations, one truth remains constant. People continue searching for places where individual lives become part of a larger story. The first sacred landscapes reveal one of the earliest surviving expressions of that search. Long before crowns, kingdoms, and written laws begin shaping history, ordinary communities discover that stone can preserve memory. Ceremony can strengthen society, and shared belief can unite people more powerfully than any ruler yet imagined. Their monuments become the quiet foundation upon which countless later civilizations unknowingly build. The oldest sacred places built by human hands do not survive because they are the largest monuments ever created. They survive because they force a reconsideration of what it means to become civilized. For centuries, the story of civilization is told through familiar milestones. The invention of writing, the rise of kings, the construction of cities, the appearance of laws, armies, and organized governments. These achievements undeniably transform human history. Yet the buried sanctuaries beneath the limestone hills reveal that something equally important happens long before any of them. People learn to believe together. That lesson may be among humanity's greatest inventions. It cannot be measured like the height of a temple or the size of a city. It leaves no fossil, no metal tool, no written equation. Instead, it appears through cooperation so successful that hundreds of individuals commit themselves to projects whose rewards cannot be carried home in a basket or counted in a storehouse. The reward is belonging. Every carved pillar represents thousands of hours of labor that provide little immediate practical advantage. The stones cannot be eaten. They cannot hunt gazelle or gather grain. They do not shelter families from winter storms in the way ordinary houses do. Their value exists somewhere else. They remind scattered communities that they are connected. That connection proves powerful enough to reshape landscapes. Viewed from this perspective, the first sacred places become far more than archaeological curiosities. They reveal an invisible technology. Not a machine of wood or stone, a technology of cooperation. Human beings possess remarkable intelligence as individuals, but our greatest strength has always been the ability to think and act collectively. Shared stories allow strangers to trust one another. Shared ceremonies encourage peaceful exchange instead of constant conflict. Shared symbols preserve identity across generations that never meet face to face. The prehistoric sanctuaries make these invisible systems visible. Stone becomes the physical expression of social relationships. Long before governments develop administrative institutions, communities discover that common purpose can organize astonishing achievements. That insight echoes throughout all of history. Every great civilization depends upon cooperation extending beyond individual families. Trade networks require trust. Cities require coordination. Agriculture requires seasonal planning. Religious traditions require shared memory. Scientific knowledge requires accumulated learning. None of these emerge suddenly. Their foundations are already visible among the first monumental gathering places. The archaeological evidence also offers an important reminder about progress. Modern societies often imagine history moving in a straight line from simplicity toward increasing complexity. Reality proves far less orderly. The people who build these sanctuaries are not failed farmers waiting to become civilized. Neither are they primitive versions of later kingdoms. They are successful communities perfectly adapted to the world they inhabit. Their choices make sense within their own historical circumstances. When agriculture gradually expands, they do not instantly abandon older traditions. When permanent villages grow, ceremonial practices evolve rather than disappearing overnight. Human history advances through adaptation instead of replacement. New ideas accumulate alongside older ones. Some traditions endure, others quietly fade. Many are transformed into forms their original creators could never have imagined. The first sacred places embody precisely this process. They stand at the meeting point between two worlds. Behind them lies the immense span of the Ice Age, during which mobile hunter-gatherer societies refine extraordinary environmental knowledge across tens of thousands of years. Ahead lies the age of agriculture villages, cities, kingdoms writing metallurgy, and eventually the civilizations whose monuments dominate textbooks today. The builders belong fully to neither world. Instead, they connect them. That position gives their achievements lasting importance. Modern archaeological research continues uncovering new details almost every year. Previously unknown ceremonial centers emerge from beneath fields and hillsides. Ancient DNA reveals unexpected relationships between populations. Improved dating techniques refine chronologies that once seemed firmly established. Microscopic analyses identify residues from meals shared thousands of years before history was written. The picture grows steadily richer. At the same time, responsible scholarship continues recognizing its own limits. Many questions remain unanswered. What songs accompany the ceremonies? What stories explain the carved animals? What names do the builders give the towering pillars? Which emotions fill the gathering places during the final ceremonies before burial begins? The evidence remains silent. Perhaps it always will, yet that silence should not be mistaken for emptiness. The absence of written explanation invites careful listening to what the archaeology can genuinely reveal. It reveals skilled craftspeople. It reveals organized communities. It reveals remarkable artistic imagination. It reveals patience extending across generations. It reveals confidence that future descendants will continue work begun by their ancestors. Most of all, it reveals hope. Every monumental project expresses confidence that tomorrow matters. No community invests years of effort constructing ceremonial landscapes unless it believes future generations will inherit them. The earliest builders therefore act not only for themselves but for people they will never meet. That decision links them unexpectedly with the modern world. Today, archaeologists preserve ancient monuments for future visitors. Scientists study climate to protect generations yet unborn. Communities restore historic buildings because memory deserves care. The motivations differ in detail, yet they spring from the same human capacity to think beyond individual lifetimes. Across 11,000 years, that capacity remains one of humanity's defining characteristics. In the end, perhaps the first sacred places teach something even larger than the origins of religion or civilization. They remind us that human history is not built only by conquerors whose names fill chronicles. It is also built by anonymous people working together toward purposes they consider meaningful. Their names vanish, their languages disappear, their descendants scatter across changing landscapes. Yet the stones endure, not as monuments to power, not as monuments to wealth, but as monuments to imagination, cooperation, and the extraordinary ability of ordinary people to create places that outlast their own lives by thousands upon thousands of years. Those windswept hills remain quiet today. The ceremonies have ended. The fires have long since burned out. The builders have become part of the deep past. And still beneath the open sky, the first sacred places continue offering one of history's gentlest but most profound reminders. Long before humanity learned to rule kingdoms, it first learned how to stand together. Word count 1084. Wind down. The stone circles rest once more beneath the wide sky surrounded by the same rolling hills that watched their creation so many thousands of years ago. The people who once climbed these slopes have long since vanished into the countless generations that followed. Their footsteps have disappeared beneath new soil. Their voices have dissolved into silence. Their stories survive only in fragments carried by carved animals, weathered limestone, and the careful work of those who patiently uncover them again. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson these ancient places offer. Civilizations are often remembered through the names of rulers, the victories of armies, or the boundaries drawn upon maps. Yet before any of those things existed, people discovered another way to leave a mark upon the world. They gathered not because they were commanded, but because they believed certain places could hold memory, strengthen community, and connect ordinary lives to something enduring. The monuments they raised were never the tallest that humanity would build. They were not covered in gold or guarded by royal palaces. Their builders possessed no crowns, no written laws, and no empires stretching across distant horizons. Even so, they created something whose significance has only grown with time. The earth protected their work through thousands of seasons until another age was ready to understand it. Looking back across that immense distance, the first sacred places seem less like isolated ruins and more like quiet beginnings. They remind us that cooperation often comes before power, that shared purpose may be older than politics, and that imagination can shape history as surely as any army or king. The wind still moves across those ancient ridges. Sunlight still traces the carved stone. Birds still pass overhead as they have for countless generations. The landscape continues patient and unhurried, holding memories far older than written history itself. And somewhere beneath that endless sky, the silent pillars remain standing, carrying forward a message without words, that long before kingdoms rose and long after they faded, human beings searched for meaning together, and in doing so left behind places where time itself seems willing to pause.